You are listening to the Enormocast.
So what do you approach in your approach shoes? El Cap, the Diamond, the Traps? How about Supercrack Buttress or the Mushroom Boulder in Waco? And what about your mailbox, your job, the local coffee shop? Have you ever approached something scary, awe-inspiring, or heartbreaking in your approach shoes? And what is your actual approach like? Do you stomp, dance, or electric slide your approaches? Or do you walk in beauty like the night of cloudless climbs and starry skies? Let's face it, climbers actually do everything from waltz to wedding vows in their approach shoes, not to mention hike, scramble, and lead those last few pitches in the dark. So why not get an approach shoe that can handle it all and look great doing it, like the TX4 from Sportiva? The mighty TX4 approach shoe sports a sticky sole, leather upper, bomber rand, and unbeatable build, as we'd expect from Sportiva. So whether you're bombing up some trail to paradise in the pre-dawn light or just kicking around town feeling the afterglow, why not approach everything with style in the TX4 from Sportiva? Check out the whole TX line at sportiva.com or your favorite local shop.
We gotta get
Listen, where you playing in town? You playing here?
We're doing the Normo Dome, whatever it is. It's terrific.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
big
big
house. We
place
sold it
outside
out.
of town. That's a
Very
big
nice.
place. You sold it out.
20,000 seats. We really should.
Look, you better get up there before you panic. Those pens are loose. You're very good. I have really enjoyed climbing with you. We'll make it. I don't think so. But we shall continue with style. Bad weather. Now or later, anytime for climbing.
Today's show is brought to you by Black Diamond Equipment, with support from Maxim Ropes.
And the fine folks at La Sportiva. And don't forget our charter sponsor, Bonfire Coffee. Go to bonfirecoffee.com and enter Enormo at checkout for a discount on great coffee and to support the Enormocast.
And now back to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Enormocast. This is your host, Chris Cluse. It is September 29th, 2019, about 11 o'clock here in Colorado, and this is episode 184 of the Enormocast, a conversation with climber and photographer Corey Rich. But before we get to that, I would like to stop and collaborate and listen. Yeah, there's a little bit of vanilla ice for you. Did you catch the Byron in the Sportiva ad? Lord Byron? Anybody? Anyone? Go back and listen. It's in there. Anyway, as I was saying, I'd like to take a second to pay you guys a compliment. I'm always astounded by how much good feedback the people who come on this show get. Most recently, I got a note from Molly Mitchell, just how amazing the response has been to her interview here, talking about her anxiety and just all the stuff that we talked about in there. And that's not unusual that the guests on here get back to me and talk about how great the response is from the listeners to what they say, how they act, how they come across on the Enormocast. And it's just really nice that pretty much 100% of the feedback that everybody gets for coming on the show is positive. Malcolm Daly actually complained that he couldn't get any work done at Neptune's because people coming up and thanking him for doing the show and talking about the stuff he said on the show. So I want to thank you all for being good climbing community citizens. Internet stuff, it can go south with the commenting and with the feedback, and very rarely, it almost never does on the Enormocast. And finally, thanks for making the guests feel like it was worth their time to sit down on the Enormocast. All right, let's get to Corey Rich. Corey is a fan of the show. We've communicated about the show over the years, and he's been interested in coming on, and finally had a really good reason to come on. He's got a book coming out. Actually, it's out. He's got a book that just came out a couple days ago, The Stories Behind the Images by Corey Rich, and we've wanted to coincide this release with the release of that book, even though I got it back a few months ago. The thing about Corey is that I think if you've followed climbing media for the last, let's say 20 years, then I think a lot of what we as consumers of climbing media think climbing looks like the mythology of climbing, the archetype of climbing has been really influenced by Corey Rich's work. And you're probably not going to be able to think of exactly what his photos are until you look back and see his name on some of the things that you've just internalized and looked at hundreds of times over the last, again, couple decades that he's been shooting photography. And, these photographers shape our image of what climbing is, what it looks like, how it feels. I think Corey's been as influential in that in the last few years as anybody. Even though he's very deferential to his influences, he's very deferential to the folks that have come before and kind of the shoulders that he's standing on. He's one of the greats, and it was a real pleasure to sit down with him. I think this is one of the favorite ones I've done in a while, just from a personal standpoint. I just had a really good time talking to him. I thought it was fascinating what he had to say about how he gets his shots, his history, and I think it's pretty funny too. He's got a great sense of humor, so I'm pretty proud of this one, and I hope you guys enjoy it. And remember, at the end of this, check out his book, The Stories Behind the Images, fresh out. You can get it anywhere that books are sold. I, of course, like to direct you all to the Mountaineers website, mountaineers.org. The publishers, go there, pay them directly. Don't necessarily give Amazon their cut. And it's over at Amazon too, if you must. Check it out, review it, put a review on any of those websites. It helps the thing float to the surface. And if you can, get in touch with Corey. Tell him what you think. All right, folks, let's do it. A conversation with Mr. Corey Rich. When you think about it, is there another gear company so dedicated to outfitting climbers from head to toe as Black Diamond? They've got lightweight modern helmets and headlamps for your pointy head, high-performance apparel to wrap that sweet climber bod you've been cultivating, all the way down to their line of advanced climbing shoes for those tender piggies. They've got crash pads for the pad sniffers, the best protection money can buy for the trad dads, ice tools for the masochists. Pitons, haul bags, portal ledges, backpacks, draws, beaners, harnesses, tents, probes, skis, poles, and even the signature Enormocast rhinestone-studded unisex microfleece G-string. Well, no, that doesn't exist yet, despite me stuffing the suggestion box every chance I get. Hit me up, BD. That's money just sitting on the table. So next time you're shopping for, well, nearly anything a climber could want, honor the generations of weary Black Diamond engineers poring over AutoCAD in their cubicles when they'd much rather be climbing. And go to blackdiamondequipment.com or your favorite local shop to see the fruits of their dedicated labor. And remember, Black Diamond is a proud sponsor of the Enormocast.
This is cool to see your podcast setup. This is awesome.
This room and this setup is kind of fun. Every time I go to a hotel room that I haven't been to before, I walk in and I'm just like, all right, what's going to work? What kind of like furniture do I have to work with? What do I have to move? I mean, I've rearranged hotel rooms completely.
Of course,
to get like some sort of setup that's comfortable and, where we can kind of look at each other and be far enough apart to have like the mics a little bit isolated. And then the freaking always the whatever HVAC system is going to always be a nightmare because some places you can't turn them off. Some of them don't go off when you turn them off. So,
I mean, this is super cool for me because I devour podcasts.
Right on.
I'm definitely travel a lot. Yeah, I mean, standing in security lines, riding my bike, sitting in a tent while it's raining. I listen to podcasts. I'm one of your listeners that has probably listened to every episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah, probably. Wow. And then I'm just a huge consumer of. Maybe that's more a statement around my life that I stand in lines too much and sit on planes too much. But the seeing behind the scenes of how you make the Holiday Inn Express work in Denver, in studio 703. I don't even know what room.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, it's funny because the podcast form, it's gotten way slicker. I mean, podcasting in general, but the original scene is DIY.
Yeah,
and even. And like Mark Maron started that, with the garage.
Yeah, of course.
And like he's become one of the biggest in the world. So, it has that aesthetic where you can get away with a lot more than what you can.
But I think you're doing this in true climber spirit. That you've kept it like it's the core conversation, but you've also the approach is scrappy enough that it's like you're not concerned about having like a studio space where here we are, where like you are in the presidential suite though.
Yeah, right.
At the Holiday Inn Express, a corner view over California Avenue.
Yeah, I'll have to post a picture of this because it is probably the nicest hotel room I've ever done this in. So welcome to the luxury suite, the nicest studio I've ever been in. It's cool talking to you as well because you and I think, well, let me say this. The reason I started the podcast or thought I could get away with like doing a podcast is by virtue of, having climbed long enough and hung around with, where they go? Just for the hell.
That's probably just the police escort for your next guest. Like they're bringing Honnold over.
Yeah.
He now has an entourage.
Yeah,
There's police up front, police in the back, and then
at a place like Denver, he's got a lot of fans here. I wish Alex come back on the show. So anyway, what I was thinking about is that the reason I started this podcast is because I've just been around climbers, and I've been sort of good enough in the sense of being in the mix, never being a sponsored professional climber, but knowing a lot of people, and that's really what made me decide that I could do this. Listen to Mark Maron. He's interviewing his friends from being in the industry. I started interviewing friends, and I was like, okay, I have a conduit to these famous climbers. And it made me sort of think of you, because you're a climber in your own right. You were a dirtbag, came up through the ranks, but part of what you do is being around all these famous people and shooting them. That's your career. And it gives you like this sort of observant insight. And I feel like myself, some other historian type, like Jeff Smoot was just on, he wrote about basically being around Alan Watts and the scene and observing it. And Dean Fidelman, too, is this guy who chronicled the scene.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, your position is like giving us these glimpses of these climbers through your camera.
I oftentimes get asked that question. People always want to know, what's your title? Like, everybody likes titles. And it's, the go-to is I'm an adventure photographer. I'm an adventure photographer and filmmaker. But in the climbing world, in a sense, holistically, what I do for a career is I'm a documentarian. I mean, really, like the work that has been the most meaningful and the photographs and the adventures, I'm documenting adventure. And now as I look in the rearview mirror a little bit, and it's hard to use that expression, but I realize I've been at this for a long time. And you look back and you realize, wow, some of those adventures, some of the, those shutter depressions or the moments that I pressed record on a video camera, those are real historical moments now in climbing history, particularly climbing history. I spend a lot of time in other kind of adventure genres, but climbing is, it's where I started. It's closest to my heart. It's who I am. It's part of who I am. And it is. It's sort of if I have to put a title, it would almost be adventure photographer, filmmaker, historian.
Right.
And I don't know. I just grew up, I think, reading John Long essays and, I appreciated the value of a good story. I've just loved, my favorite part of climbing, I think, is sitting around a campfire and, weaving yarns and hearing your buddies tell crazy adventure stories and sitting in planes and trains and automobiles and, sharing tales and then having an adventure that you can then share at the next campfire. And photography has always been, it's one tool in that storytelling toolbox where it's, one, you need to be able to sit there and just weave a yarn. You need to be able to sit around a campfire and tell a great story and kind of regurgitate the key facts. And, I also appreciate that in the climbing world, stories get better over time.
Right.
They age almost like wine.
Right.
It's sort of, and I don't know, early on, I just loved that. Like my very first climbing trip, I was 13 years old and my junior high school PE teacher invited me to go rock climbing, and my dad was a school teacher, and so he said yes. And so my brother and I got in a Bob Porter's pickup truck at Quartz Hill High School, and he whisked us into the Sierra Nevada mountains with another math teacher. And just everything about that experience, from the moment we got into the car, got in the car, my dad said, don't do anything dumb. And I remember Bob Porter opening like a 40 pack of powdered donuts, and he had coffee in one hand and a Budweiser in the center console. He was like the PE leadership teacher, and George was a math teacher. And my older brother was, he's 2 years older. He's sitting next to me in the back of the truck. And the back of the pickup truck was full of climbing ropes and, hexes. And just the storytelling started. That's the next thing I remember. It was the aroma of 7-Eleven coffee, powdered donuts, and storytelling. And I fell in love with everything about that first climbing experience. We're at Dome Rock below the Needles, and we're climbing scary bolted routes, and it was just mental, it was physical, and like the culture was, I guess I connected that very first day.
Right.
It was sort of, I realized that this a part of me. I didn't know what it meant then, but I look back at that very first trip, and that was exposure to climbing, but it was also exposure to storytelling, because I sat in that truck, and for 2.5 hours driving to Dome Rock, I heard story after story. And I now look back, and Bob Porter, who was a school teacher, he was a quintessential climber in that he could also tell a damn good story.
Right. Yeah.
Which is key, I think, right? Some of the great climbers are also great storytellers.
Well, it's almost like, your feats in some way speak for themselves, but it definitely helps, if you can tell the tale of it as well for them to last. I mean, the Stone Masters are a classic example of that. Like, they basically have this PR agent that's been going at it for 40 years of telling the stories of those guys doing those climbs. And it's only reason we remember them.
No, it's true. I go back to that first climbing trip, and I loved everything about it. And then, every weekend, virtually every weekend from that point forward, I wanted to go climbing. And so, George and Bob became my climbing partners. And, 2 or 3 weeks into my kind of, the beginning of my climbing lifestyle, I realized it was hard to bring just a story back to the playground. Literally, I'm standing on like a playground with my buddies in junior high school, and I'm telling them stories about, this old 1/4 incher, and I'm out on lead, and I'm going to take a huge whipper. And then I realized it wasn't connecting. And I thought, I need to bring like visual proof back. Right. And so I borrowed my dad's camera, and my dad was a school teacher, and, he was a hobbyist of a photographer. And he had a pretty nice camera at the time. And so I borrowed this SLR, with interchangeable lenses. And I brought that on, that weekend adventure. And my photos were just awful. They were awful. It turns out it's not just because you have a nice camera, you can make a compelling storytelling photograph. And then kind of within like a month-long period, 2 parallel pursuits were born, which was this passion for being outside, having adventures of my own with my friends, and this pursuit for storytelling and making compelling, meaningful storytelling pictures. And I had no idea at that moment that they just perfectly aligned. Right. It turned out like, each passion fed the other, and they just overlapped seamlessly. And I just started devouring every bit of information I could on climbing, but also on photography. Uh-huh. And so I'd, check out every book at the library about climbing, and I'd try to get my hands on all the issues of Climbing Magazine, Rock and Ice Magazine, and then I'd be devouring books about photography and, science. And sort of the passions grew in parallel. And, finally, I had no idea at that moment in time that it would, influence the rest of my life, of course.
First of all, yeah, if it was a SLR, you had to, those things weren't necessarily just easy to use.
No.
So you had a lot to learn. But that's really an interesting, 13 years old, and that's a funny image of you like trying to spray down your buddies on the playground using jargon, like they'd heard in the front seat of that pickup truck.
Who couldn't care less either. They had no idea what I was talking about. They just,
A quarter what? Inch what? A whipper? What the, you're lucky you didn't get punched, get beat up, right? And don't be different, kid.
I think they just felt sorry for me, probably. They're like, what is this guy talking? Yeah, he's already lost his mind.
Well, the other part of that story, and it's funny because I have a parallel existence. It wasn't with climbing. It just was straight backpacking, which was, I was in the Midwest. But I had Wally Sitz, literally, 7th grade PE teacher.
Wow.
Literally.
Wow.
No joke. would run these backpacking trips where you'd go for the weekend with him and another gym teacher in a group and go backpacking. And it was the same experience with, piling into his van. Like from 7th grade on, I already wanted a van in 19.
That's hilarious. You already knew. You already knew that.
And he had like a cook box in the back, like proto,
awesome.
like a brown Ford Econo, like that rust brown.
Yeah.
And what he would do, and I know this podcast is about you, but we know how the Enormocast works. So, because this is just really interesting that this is, because I started this show with talking about parallels, is he would go up, and what he would do is there was this little trail system in Wisconsin, and he would drop us off at night, late at night. Like we'd leave school after school, we'd drive out there a few hours, we'd have dinner at a restaurant, and then he would drop us off like at 10 o'clock at night in the woods and just be like, go that way. And, the first time that happened to me as a 7th grader, an adult just says, peace.
Right.
Like it's the middle of the night. You don't know where you're going. He says, follow this trail. Was just intoxicating to me and a few other guys. And just, again, like this, and then he kind of had this lore around him because he knew everything about how to survive or how to be out in the woods as a camp. And it sounds silly to us as like
it sounds
modern
like
climbers.
Now it sounds like Navy SEAL training.
Like, kind of
They're like, okay, guys, today's our.
Well, and we were suspicious. There was rumors like that. It's totally fabricated about how like what his past life had been like. But the cool thing was, as I found out as I grew up and got on sort of the other side, is that he was watching us.
Right.
Like he would go and like stand in the woods, and we'd walk right by him, and
that's great.
Yeah.
But it's crazy how that changes. Cool thing, it changes your. I mean, it changes your world, and it's something I think about a lot now. And I think it comes a little later in life. Now I'm 43, and I think a lot about like paying it forward. Mm-hmm. And I'm, I always joke that if I weren't a climber, I would be a teacher. Not joke. I mean, I think if the photography thing didn't work out, I would definitely be a teacher. And I think I look back at what Bob and George and a few other teachers like provided, and it's what you just described, this sort of taking kids and like giving them this opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I don't think Bob or George understood like what this would mean to me or how that would help shape who I become as an adult and as a person. But I do take this just huge pride and joy in kind of standing in front of a small group of folks that are passionate about photography or passionate about storytelling and kind of just putting it out there. Because I always like to dream. I love that someone in that room of 30 or 50 people that I'm speaking to, I hope I like move the needle a little bit for one of them. Mm-hmm. And later they're talking about me in the same way that I just talked about my mentors, or you're talking about your mentor, because that's what it takes, right? That's how we're exposed to sort of the things that change our lives, the biggest passions, the most powerful things in our lives, is someone just kind of cracks open the door and you get a glimpse, you get a whiff of like, for me, it was that 7-Eleven coffee and Dome Rock. Mm-hmm. And that was it. Like, it was all a done deal.
He primed me to be a climber because it was like pretty soon where those trails weren't adventurous enough. And we got it dialed. And he talked, I remember him distinctly before I knew what the hell he was talking about, talked about climbing at Devil's Lake, being stuck in a chimney and all this thing. Again, like words I didn't understand, but it definitely, I mean, I got a van before I was out of high school. I drove it to Colorado, the whole thing. So it's this wild moment where it all comes together. Let me ask you about your amateur junior photography world. So do you remember, like, you said your first images sucked. Do you remember like the first roll you developed, or some of the first things you took that you were like, wow, I'm getting there, or maybe somebody else recognized as being awesome?
What I realized pretty quickly was that photography was hard. When you were shooting film on a SLR camera, and I was processing it in a dark room in black and white, and I actually realized somehow I figured out that maybe photographing climbing isn't going to be the easiest way to grow as a photographer. So I just wanted to shoot a lot. It was that 10,000 hour rule. I didn't know. I couldn't have said that to you when I was 13, but somewhere inside of me, I realized, or someone told me, you just need to shoot more, kid. Like, you suck. Right. So you need to shoot more. Your photos are awful. So you need to do it more. And so I I went down this road of working in the journalism world. So I managed to get a job. Now I'm like 16 years old, and I get a work permit to work for the Antelope Valley Press. And I had a literature teacher, another teacher that had a huge impact on my life, James Duprat. He was my American Lit teacher. And his wife was the managing editor of the newspaper in our little town, the Palmdale, Lancaster, the Antelope Valley. And so I end up at the Antelope Valley Press, and the director of photography kind of says, hey, kid, you can come in and work for us. And so I borrow my dad's truck, and I get the assignment to shoot the real estate section, which is, back then that was, you'd get a list of like 100 houses, like addresses, and you'd drive around town, and the goal was to not get out of the car, but like shoot a picture of a house that's going to go in the real estate section. But it was a lot, and it just forced you to solve exposure and composition issues. And the funniest part about that job is, I was so pumped. I was so proud of myself.
Honnold's heading over to Real Rock, I think.
He's going to give his talk.
Anyways,
that's awesome.
Sorry.
That's awesome. The funniest thing about that job, so, this is a huge deal for me. I have a job at the newspaper shooting, the worst photos in the newspaper. And they issue me like a camera bag with cameras and a radio. And my number was photo 6 on the radio. So the boss...
Sort of cool.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I felt like a baller. I was like, I'm like 16. I had press credentials, a camera bag full of gear, and a radio, and a title, Photo 6. And I am in my dad's pickup truck, and I pull out of the parking lot. And the boss tells me, Gene Breckner, he says, if anything goes wrong when you're out there, you immediately call back to the newspaper on the radio. And maybe I had a pager too. And I pull out of the parking lot. I make it no more than 1 block, and I rear end a car. And my very first transmission back to the newspapers, photo desk, this is Photo 6. And they're like, go, Corey. I said, I just got in a car accident. And I there for a minute, and I felt so bad. I'm sweating, and I'm just feeling well, that's it. That's the end of my, that was a short-lived real estate photo section career. But what really came out of that was, I was doing this work at the newspaper, and they forced me out to shoot photos every day. I'd get 4 or 5 assignments. And it's like climbing, right? The more you go and you try that hand crack and you experiment, it's that 10,000 hour rule. Mm-hmm. And I just got better and better and better and better. And then it took a while actually then I had these almost separated lives where I was climbing in every free moment. I loved climbing, but then I was shooting photos in the newspaper world. And then finally, by the time I got to college, I sort of combined the two. They sort of kind of reconverged, and I realized, wait, now everything I learned about storytelling and photography and the technical aspects, now I should apply it to the thing I care the most about. Because I was shooting everything from the dog of the week to the real estate section to the photo of the mayor to the 4th of July parade. And it's, I didn't care about that stuff. It's not what I was passionate about. But it was like doing laps. That's what it was. It was endurance training. I was just going out there and just doing pitch after pitch, with pressing that shutter button. And that allowed me to kind of hone my eye and hone my skill set, so that by the time I started really photographing climbing, I just had way more experience. I just knew, and this is all pre-digital. So it was sort of, it was really hard to expose slide film and not screw it up. And it was expensive.
Yeah, that's like the roll after roll thing just keeps me thinking that.
Oh yeah,
how expensive it was to get all that stuff processed.
I did the math at one point when I was living in my Honda Civic, driving around the United States, taking pictures of climbing, and it was I think there was a moment where every time I depressed the shutter, it was 25 cents.
Right.
Which on a climber's budget, and for a kid that took a semester off from college, that was a lot of money. It was a big deal. It was kind of how am I going to pay this back? How am I going to? I hope one of these frames is good enough to pay off this roll of film and the gas that it took to get here.
Yeah, but it's like a Ponzi scheme because you're paying off, you're paying for the rolls you haven't exposed yet with the rolls you exposed, or you're trying
that's
to
right.
anyway.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's true.
Let's fast forward to that. You said you're in your Civic on a photographing climbing. Like, well, how did that sort of start in terms of traveling and and I'm sure it was like photographing your buddies at first, and then you decided to go out into the world as a climbing or adventure photographer.
Yeah, the way it happened was as oftentimes happens with sort of the biggest changes in our lives, I'm 18 years old, 19 years old, I'm sitting at San Jose State University. Miraculously, like I was maintaining a decent GPA because I spent like 90% of my time in Yosemite and 10% of my time on campus, and I was studying journalism, and I finally had this realization in my sophomore year that my calling was to be out photographing climbing. And I was doing it in all of my spare time, all of my free time. I was photographing climbing.
What years what's this?
By the way, I should give the forward that I'm terrible with dates, but I'm guessing just like 95, 95-ish,
okay,
96.
So the 90s.
Yeah, mid to late 90s. Yeah.
Did we know each other?
I'm amazed that we never crossed paths.
Because that's the years I was climbing in the valley a lot, but I never hung there.
Yeah.
I never I was a sort of smash and grab guy.
And I was probably the same. I was never the guy hanging out in Camp 4.
Right, okay, me neither.
Because I was either on a wall shooting photos, or I was back in college pretending to be a student.
Okay. Yeah.
And so anyhow, I'm kind of like doing both, managing to maintain a decent GPA, and then I have this epiphany that I need to take a semester off from school. I just need to like go and follow my passion. I need to go and make pictures of climbing. And I'll never forget going home one Thanksgiving and sitting down with my dad and mom at the table. And I said, Mom and Dad, I have this plan. I'm going to take a semester off from school. And my dad, not being a lawyer, drafted a contract that said, he didn't like the idea, but he agreed to allow me to take a semester off. But it said, you will return to college. He made like sign it at the Thanksgiving table. And I do remember thinking in my head as I was signing it, as I read that last sentence, it said, you will return to college. It didn't say you would finish or when.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was it.
You're using the lawyer logic.
Yeah, I was like, I was I was using like the lawyer logic, but so I took a semester off. I bought a Honda Civic, and I bought 100 rolls of Fuji Velvia film.
Velvia.
Yep, and
juice.
It was. I mean, it was the magic, and I loaded my car full of camp stove and food, and I think I can't remember. I always say that I had like $3,000 to my name, but I think I used most of it for film. So I don't remember the number,
right.
how much cash I had in my pocket. And I just started driving around the West, and I would pull up to climbing areas, and I would walk up to the campfire where folks were sitting, and I'd say, hey, I'm Corey. I'm a photographer. Can I photograph you guys tomorrow? I mean, that was my deal. And I'd always have, I learned early, like had a 6-pack of beer in my hand, and I'd start offering up beers. And I think it was like 99 times out of 100, the answer was, yeah, sure, come on out with us. And it was just fully trial. It was learning through trial and error. Mm-hmm. And, I remember the first couple of shoots that I did. I went to the Needles first. I remember that was my very first stop.
Oh, you're biting it off.
I just went right into it, yeah.
Cool. It's too hot to go to J-Tree, which would have been a lot easier.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's what it was. I think it was like a spring semester that I took off. And I remember I also had a super thick static robe that weighed 50 pounds when you carried it around. Because I safety first. But
right.
I have no idea why I had such a thick static. I could barely fit my Jumars on the static line. It was so thick. But I remember the first couple of folks I photographed, I didn't ask anything beyond, can I photograph you? And they'd go out at they'd stay out late at the fire, and then they'd go out at noon and rock climb, and it just looked awful. It was just terrible photos. And then I had to kind of switch up my pitch at the campfire, which was, hey, first I'd drink a beer with them and hand out some beers. Then I'd tell them what I'm doing. Then I'd ask if they'd let me photograph them. And then I kind of learned the art of kind of convincing them that actually what they want to do is get up at 4 a.m. and hike in the dark. And then you're going to lead the scariest pitch of your life, but in the best light of the day.
Yeah, sure.
And that became, I didn't understand how important that kind of art of persuasion really was in this career, in that there's a lot of, and that doesn't matter whether it's with Alex Honnold or like the guy you met at the campfire. There's a difference between like there are situations that yield wonderful photographs, and there are situations that I don't care who you are, like the most talented photographer on the planet, it's not going to make a great photo. Like climbing at high noon, in like half sun, half shade, where their body's cut in half. And so it's just this. It was like the school of photography for me, climbing photography.
Right.
Of some things, and there's different situations. There's being a true documentarian where you show up and whatever's happening, you photograph that expedition, that climb, and they're authentic, real moments. And then there are moments where it's no coincidence that they're on the side of, that piece of granite at 6 a.m. and the sun is in the perfect spot. It's like that. Usually it's not coincidence.
Right.
Usually there was some persuasive conversation the night before at the campfire to get those folks out there.
Well, nowadays it's professional, like they owe you the moment, because that's why I tell them, like, anytime you see anyone climbing hard in the sun, that's a bullshit photograph.
That's true. That's a really good point. Yeah, it was just a funny thing. I just learned pretty early on. I'm driving around in my Honda Civic, and my pitch got better.
Right.
Sort of sincerity was the key. That was the other thing I realized. People, I've been told later that like the thing was I was just this super passionate kid, and like people can feel that, like when someone approaches you and they're just passionate and they care about what they're doing and they're working hard. And I definitely was that. And then I started to learn, what did it mean? How do you actually make great photographs? And I had this deal with the Modesto Bee. I'd interned at the Modesto Bee while I was in college, another newspaper. And, I was broke. And so I would ship, every time I'd shoot 10 rolls of film, I'd ship them to the Modesto Bee, and they would process the film for free for me. And then the photo department would like gather around the light table, 6 photographers and the director of photography. And I would call in from a payphone. This was like before, cell phones, of course. And they would give me like a report on like, how did the film look, and critique my photography. They weren't climbers, but they understood like the visual language of what was compelling and what wasn't. And they love, I have this one memory of I'm standing in a phone booth in like the middle of Utah. And, it's this, I've coordinated, hearing feedback, and they've processed my 10 rolls of slide film. And, they get on the phone and they say, "Corey, do you want the good news or the bad news first?" And I say, "Oh man, I guess the bad news first." And they say, "Look, all your film is black." And, like literally like tears come to my eyes, because that's like 2 weeks worth of being on the road and like serious blood, sweat, and tears and early starts, and then the long pause, and they say, "We're just kidding. We're just kidding." And then they would give me like real feedback. Right. They would say like, "Look, we're seeing, some technical stuff. Like I think there's sand and, there's dirt scratching one of your cameras. You need to clean that out." But then they would give real creative feedback. Right. Like, "Man, the photographs of climbing, like the figures in the landscape, awesome. Like you're getting that, some of that, top down, peak action, fantastic, like great moments. But we're not seeing any of the lifestyle that surrounds. Like, what are you guys doing between climbs?"
That's good advice.
These were journalists.
That's
these are
bread and butter now.
Absolutely. I mean, that was, and I think that feedback, I think early in my career, turns out those are the pictures that were sort of the most important and maybe moved the needle the most for me. It was those lifestyle pictures, the journalistic, documentary style photographs,
right?
Of. Like I always say that climbers like to believe that we climb all the time. We spend way more time talking about climbing and bullshitting about climbing and, reliving what we just climbed and talking about what we're going to climb,
right?
And killing time around the campfire. And so I really made a point of shooting a lot of that. It was sort of those gritty, raw, authentic photographs of climbing culture. And honestly, that set of pictures, I think, kind of advanced. I think that's the set of pictures that allowed me to do this for a living.
I have a question for you. So it's the mid 90s. You were talking about Epperson.
Yeah.
So who else is like got the climbing photography thing on lock at that point?
I mean, Greg was my hero. Greg Epperson, of course. Greg wrote the book on, he established the bar. Right. For like, this is what a great photograph looks like, a great climbing photograph. Jim Thornburg was right there. I mean, Jim is just an incredibly talented guy. Brian Bailey was still in the world at that moment. I don't know if you know Brian.
Yeah. He lived in Carbondale.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I feel like
I think he's up in Missouri Heights, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Brian and Greg and Jim, all of them just superstars. They were like my role models. Galen was a role model as well, Galen Rowell. But I think Galen was much more on the he was I think he was like a generation before Greg and Jim and Brian.
And he's got great climbing photographs, a lot of them historical, but
he's
I
like
always
a
think of
landscape guy.
Yeah, the big mountain landscapes was like really where his sort of legacy is, I think.
And I mean, later I want to come back to talking about Tom Frost, because when people ask, I mean, Tom Frost was like my true hero as a photographer. I mean, and I didn't figure that out until like later in life, like in my adult, later in my life, I sat down with Tom Frost and edited Tom's work. Like I went to his house and Tom laid out like his binders of images. And I had this sort of like magical experience with Tom where I started, I mean, I look at a lot of photography. I mean, I look at hundreds of portfolios a year and, my takes and the takes of other photographers. And I sat down and looked at Tom's work once in his office in Oakdale. I think it's Oakdale, was outside of Yosemite. Tom being an engineer by trade, he had all of his work super organized. And I sat down with the Loop and Joyce, his then wife, and Tom. I'm looking through the Loop and I go to first page of this binder, and I'm going through, and every photo is like incredible. Some of them are like the iconic photographs, and in between the iconic photographs are like images that should be the iconic photographs that the world has never seen. And I make it through like a few pages of the binder, I'm comparing the contact sheet to the negative, and I'm going back and forth. And I at one point I just casually say to Tom, how long had you been shooting photographs? Like, these are like incredible photographs. And Tom's confused by my question, and I re-ask it in a different way. And Tom says, no, that's my first set of photographs.
Right. I was about to,
And
they're in order.
And
they're
beginning. In order.
Right.
Like it's literally like the first photograph is a freaking classic. Maybe there's one out of focus frame of his foot or something first.
Right.
And then the next one is like a classic frame in Camp 4 of like everybody at a table sorting pitons. And he finally says, no, I borrowed a camera that morning in Camp 4 because we were going to go up on El Cap. And then, I spend the next 6 hours at his house, like looking through his photography. And I realized Tom Frost might have been the most naturally gifted photographer, period, that I've ever met.
Okay.
Period. Like outside of, which is just unbelievable. Like later, Tom and I sat and had lunch that day. And, I kept on trying to get back at that question of, maybe he just missed. Maybe like he's just not acknowledging his experience with a camera or seeing, and it's just that's the reality. Like Tom just had this gift, and I guess I say this because folks will oftentimes point at Galen Rowell as sort of the grandfather of adventure photography. I think like Tom Frost came before Galen. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's pictures that Galen mimicked, that Greg mimicked, that Brian mimicked, that Jim has mimicked, that I've mimicked. It's like we're all standing on Tom Frost's shoulders when it comes to, that what a great climbing photograph looks like. I mean, it's sort of amazing what the guys in the golden age of Yosemite climbing did with cameras, but they don't get credit for it. And that's, so, I say that because you ask who were my heroes. When I was a kid, it was Greg Epperson, Jim Thornburg, Brian Bailey. But then as I got older, I sort of realized, oh, wow, actually it was Tom Frost. Like Tom was the guy. Tom was the Jedi master. He was like the guy that I think we all now look at as he was the most gifted photographer and a pioneer of climbing. Yeah, just a fantastic human.
What's sort of the inspiration from like Glenn Denny?
I never was as close to Glenn.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his work, I put him in the same category.
Right. And
I've never sat down and talked with Glenn. I guess what always has blown me away about Tom is he never like considered himself a photographer.
Right.
I mean, I think I've read enough from Glenn. I think he considered himself a photographer.
Oh yeah,
he took it seriously.
Sure.
And it's kind of, I don't know what to compare it to. Tom Frost was like a 5'14" photographer,
right,
back then, but he never considered himself a photographer, and that's extraordinary. Right. The rest of us, myself, the next generation, the guys before me, we took it seriously, and we consider ourselves storytellers. Tom didn't.
Right.
And yet he was as good or better than
He's
all
like
of us.
the Taoist photographer.
Yeah, that's
right.
it. Yeah. So I don't know. That was a tangent.
No, it's a great tangent. And it's interesting because, I brought up Glendenny because, we talk about the golden age, and I sort of made this half joke about how the Stonemasters had a PR person, which is why we know about them. But, and this speaks to I think the nature, sort of a philosophical part of photography, is that to us, the golden age, what it looked like is those two plus Galen Rowell and a few other people. That's it. I mean, it's like it creates the reality of what we see from that era. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
It is the reality because it's all we have.
Right.
And so it's like, those shirts off dudes with their beaners out and their pins laid out, and those images fill up, a 10-year period of activity.
Yeah.
And there's really 20 or 30 of these photographs that create the golden age for us.
What's amazing to me is that I look at that set of imagery, whether Tom Frost created it, Glendenny, Galen Rowell, and what they did, what they created, that style of image, those gritty, raw, authentic photographs, it's what we still aspire to create. I mean, that's what we go out and try to create. And when we create an image that's as raw and as alive as the photo of the guy sitting at the table in Camp 4, that's a huge success. And it's fascinating that I those aren't easy moments to create. I guess that's my point. Those aren't easy moments to capture. And so to look back, 50 years at this point, and those images they're still kind of the benchmark,
right,
for what are we trying to achieve.
Right.
I mean, those are the photographs in my career when I create something that feels that authentic, that is that authentic, that's that real, that tells a story in a single photograph. That's a huge success. Uh-huh. And so to see that, they had that vision 50 years ago, and we're standing on their shoulders. We're trying to build on that. And I think the expectation's higher today. I think it's you as a professional, you don't come back with a single image or 3 images from a trip. It's like you better be able to fill a catalog and billboards, and there's a big demand, and you need variation in verticals and horizontals because the web needs a horizontal and the Instagram needs a vertical, but it's that level of authenticity is what we're still striving for.
Right. So going back to where we left on the tangent, which was fine because I started it with asking about your inspirations. The reason I wanted to know is because as you were talking about the lifestyle photos, okay, so this is back to you've got these guys telling you that's really cool,
right?
It made me think that I don't really recall a lot of that in the magazines in this era, and from necessarily Greg and Jim. But then you reminded me that was where it started with Frost. But do you know what I mean? Or am I wrong about that? Is that just, am I losing it in my mind? Because all the iconic, in my mind, like Epperson images are just very stark color contrast. He's very good at getting the color differences and stuff, and just very athletic, a lot of very athletic photos. And then we all, we know what Jim liked to shoot. So, but just those, athletic, awe-inspiring, upside down,
right,
types of things. Or am I not?
No. I think those are still. I mean, those are the iconic images. But when I look at, what separated me, I think, from the pack, because I never considered myself as a guy that was competing with Jim or Greg or Brian at all. I mean, they were my heroes. But I do realize that, so I come back from the 6 months on the road. My dad made me sign the contract. I went back to college, and I'm sitting at San Jose State University. I bought a light table, and I had 100 rolls of film, and I edited those 100 rolls of film down to, I think it was 40 of the best climbing photos I sent to Climbing Magazine, and 40 of the best lifestyle images I sent to Patagonia. And I had read an article in some photography magazine that said look, and it's called an unsolicited submission. No one knew who the hell I was, nor did they want those photos. But I paid $12 a FedEx envelope, and I shipped, the climbing submission, and I shipped the Patagonia submission. But the little article said, you're going to ship it off, and And 3 or 4 months later, you're going to get a letter with all of your slides back that says, "Thanks, pal. Keep your day job."
Yeah.
And I was prepared for that. It was fine. I'm like a college student. But I took like great pride in like editing these pictures. It was 6 months of like being on the road. The best 6 months of my life. Like I had tasted it. Like this is all I wanted. But there was zero validation except for my, 6 friends at the Modesto Bee that occasionally like told me I shot a nice frame. And the next day I'm sitting in my dorm room and the phone rings and, I answer it like any college student. "What's up?"
Right.
Thinking it's like my buddy down the hall. And it's an adult voice. And she said, "It's Corey Richin." And of course I had no option but to, "Yeah, hang on." I'm like, "Corey." And then of course I'm, "Hello, this is Corey." Yeah.
Hello, yes.
And in my head I'm thinking, which faculty member is this and what did I do wrong? Like what like what else could this be? My world was so narrow.
Yeah.
and I'll never forget, she said, "Hey, this is Jennifer Ridgway at Patagonia." And she said, "Is this Corey?" And I said, "Yeah, this is Corey." And she said, "Who are you?" And I was so confused by, I'm sort of like, oh, was it the "what's up" answer?
Right,
Did she figure me out? And then she went on to say a few complimentary things. She said, "We just got this submission and there's 40 photographs and there's some really nice stuff in here." And she said, "Gosh, we'd like to use a few of them in our next catalog." And I was just so naive. I had no idea what that meant. And now to put it in perspective, I had just worked like all summer at a newspaper to save $3,000 to drive around the country in my Honda Civic. And she said, "We're going to use a couple of these photos if it's okay." And then she threw out a number. It's like, it's $3,000 a photo. And, I think I might have fallen out of my chair and like had to stand back
At least drop the bomb.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like beer cans flying off the, And it was like, one, it was the very first validation. It was someone, it was, sort of like, it was Jennifer Ridgway, Rick Ridgway's wife, the director of photography at Patagonia, saying these are good. Mm-hmm. And, I'm a kid that grew up looking at like 3 publications, National Geographic, Climbing Magazine, and the Patagonia catalog. And like, this was sort of one of the 3 gods just called and said, "This is decent stuff. Like you have decent photography." And then on top of that, they were going to pay me for it.
Right.
And pay me like 3x what I made working at the newspaper the summer before.
Right.
And it was pretty much like that day, that phone call pretty much changed my world. It was sort of like I went out and bought another 100 rolls of film. I like advanced the film. That check might not show up for months. Yeah. But like I kind of like at that moment, my GPA, it was almost like a direct correlation. Right. I started getting published a lot, and my GPA went down in direct proportion to just getting and going on trips.
Literally studying photography?
I was studying journalism.
Oh, journalism.
And mass communication.
Okay. Yeah.
Studying might be a stretch.
Right.
But yeah, I was attending the journalism.
Paid money to,
that's
I don't know, for the dorm room. Or somebody had.
My mother and father. Yeah. And then the next day, I'm sitting in, now I'm super savvy when the phone rang. And so the next day the phone rings and I say, "Hello, this is Corey." And it was Jeff Aki at Climbing Magazine. He wasn't as complimentary. Jeff, there was no flowery language. But he did say, he said, "Hey, look, I think he might have actually, hey, pal, one of your pictures is, we're considering it for the magazine." Yeah. And he wanted like some captions. And like, the conversation was brief. It was like, I answered the question. I heard the wind of the telephone, like as he put it down. It was like, whoom, whack. And 2 months later, one of my photographs was on the cover of Climbing Magazine, and it was the photograph of a young Danish climber bouldering in the Happies in a bikini top. Yeah, and that was so like kind of the Patagonia catalog came out, and that cover of Climbing Magazine came out, and Dwayne Raleigh has since told me that was the best-selling issue of a climbing magazine in the history of the world.
Yeah, I remember the photograph burned in many a young man's psyche. Yeah. But also it was very controversial because of like, the sex sells kind of nature of it. And that's why, it worked.
I always joke that I think, it was a great photograph because of the way I used the light,
Oh, absolutely.
the composition.
Yeah. No,
but
the
it's
shadows falling upon.
It was definitely, and by the way, Ricky is like the most extraordinary human that I've ever met. She's an attorney for the Red Cross in Denmark. She's actually like saving the world. She's out there doing. But it was, it was honestly one of those scenarios where we're at the Happy Boulders. This is a long time ago. I should look at the date on that magazine cover. That would be a good like time stamp. And it was super hot, and it's all the guys had their shirts off, and Ricky being a Dane, she's like, well, if you're taking your shirts off, I'm taking off mine. It's hot. It's super hot.
Right.
I snapped a few frames. Frankly, it wasn't even like a great setup for photography, and at 25 cents a frame, I was like very conscious of like, I don't even know if this is worth shooting.
Right.
And but it turns out that was like my first cover. And
off of your first submission.
Very first submission.
Yeah.
The Patagonia submission, like 3 images go in the catalog. And what's amazing about that Patagonia submission, I think back now to like, I think it's just luck and like a hell of a lot of hard work. Every single one of those 40 images that I submitted, every one of them got used over the next decade.
Jesus,
man. And it kind of blew, there was this huge pressure though. That first phone call with Jennifer Ridgway, Jennifer, she's like, who are you? And I guess I figured it out on the phone. What she was asking was, this is a solid submission, but we've never heard your name before. We don't know who you are. Where did this come from?
Right.
And then on one hand, there was this huge celebration of like validation, like, wow, like someone loved the photography. At another level, it was like, damn, I hope I can do this again.
Right.
I hope that wasn't like my one hurrah. And now it's like, yeah, God, can I repeat that?
Uh-huh.
But obviously photography is something where it's just time. Like
right.
you just need time out there making pictures. You need, you can't schedule it. Like
yeah. Well, also to just to put it into perspective, because it's 2019, and it's been the age of digital photography for a long time and the internet. What we're talking about, the Patagonia catalog, not just for photographers, but for everyone, was like a celebrated experience when it showed up at your house. And, it was this repository of adventure photography that was super important because you submitted the climbing, Rock and Ice probably didn't exist yet, or it was,
I can't remember.
Was it just?
I think it was, but it's so confusing because
they switched.
Yeah, everyone switched.
But nevertheless, climbing. There wasn't like a million places to put your photographs like there is now.
No.
And so really, you hit the top of the heap with those two things because that's what it was. And I remember, even as a climber, if you got, and is this the same? I don't even know anymore. But if you were in your photograph, a climber got a $100 gift certificate for being in the photograph because Greg went on a trip to the Circuit of the Unclimbables. I went on a trip with Greg and ended up in there, so it's like $100, which Patagonia gets you like one sock.
No, I think they still do that.
Yeah. Okay. Right, cool. Yeah. So, but it just because of the internet, it's sort of and digital photography. I don't know where you lament any of this, but it's definitely diluted this the importance of this catalog.
Right.
Like the catalog itself was the yearly best climbing photography in the world.
Yeah.
And it showed up at your door.
That's how I grew up. That's for sure.
Yeah.
It has changed, I will say. And when I made the comment about Dwayne Raleigh telling me that it was the best-selling issue of a climbing magazine ever, part of that was the photograph and just, sort of, it just did well. Part of it was that was the beginning of print dying. That was the reality. Part of it was, we were 20 years out from Instagram and we had, what was just social media became a reality. The internet became a reality. And so I don't actually know if the Patagonia catalog, I know it doesn't have the same impact in my life.
Right.
It's sort of, there's just so much noise now.
Yeah, totally. No, I can say the same thing. It shows up. You're like, oh, cool.
Yeah. And I feel that way about magazines. I hate to say it. I wish I didn't feel this way. I get a copy of National Geographic and I might flip through it. Rock and Eyes, I might flip through. It's like, everything that I get, it's all digital. Like everything that I see, it's like if it surfaces to the top of my feed, then I should look at it. And it's not that I don't care. It's just, times have changed.
Well, yeah, and it's like a couple grandpas talking here, but the importance of the arrival of those magazines. Any guest that I talk to that's my age or a little older, the importance of these magazines to climbing culture was everything. They were climbing culture in the United States, climbing and then followed by rock and ice. And they just aren't anymore. They're just not anymore, you know? And it was a strange thing because, somebody like Michael Kennedy, who's running climbing, before Jeff, but they, those the editors at these magazines really could set the tone of a climbing culture by their decisions about what was going on in those magazines. And therefore, your photographs as photographers at that time, and you rode the shoulder over into digital. You guys, Greg, before you, Jim, you guys set the tone of climbing culture as well with the photographs.
Yeah, it's funny. I think back to the impact of working for the magazines, editorials. Right. In the photography trade, we'd call it editorial. And I was a kid in college, and after that first submission to Jeff Aki, he called back a few days later. And he said, "Hey, can I get your fax number, buddy?" And, so I said, I didn't have a fax number. I said, "I don't know it off the top of my head, so let me call you back." And I went to like Staples and bought a fax machine and hooked it up in my dorm room. And Jeff wanted that fax machine number because they would send a needs list for the next like issue of the magazine. So it was every story they were going to tell, and they were asking, photographers to like ship in their slides. But I was, 19 years old in college, 20 years old. And so I interpreted that very differently. I would get a fax and this is the next issue of Rock and Ice. It's like feature story on Yosemite, feature story on, Devil's Tower, feature story on, Cirque of the Unclimbables. And I would look at my calendar and I'd say, how many of these places can I go to in the next 30 days before the deadline and make pictures of? And I'd get in my Honda Civic and I'd buy another 100. My ratio of like film that I would shoot, it was going way up. Like now I would shoot like 100 rolls of film in like 3 weeks, and I would just drive to all of the areas, and then I'd put together a massive submission of photos and ship it to Jeff or Climbing and Rock and Ice. And I'll never forget once Dwayne Raleigh called me, and I started getting published a ton. It was like all of a sudden, I had a feature story in every magazine or cover on one or the other. And at one point Dwayne called and he said, "And I'm confused, like, you went from like a guy that we had never seen your name, we'd never published any of your photos, to you have like a third of every magazine we publish. Where did this archive of work come from?" And of course, me being like a naive college kid, I said, "What do you mean? You guys send me a list of like everything to go out and shoot." And Dwayne's a really smart guy, and Dwayne paused for a second, then he laughed and he said, "Wait, so you just go out and shoot everything on the list?" And I said, "Yeah, isn't that how that works?" And that was it, like, because I had nothing, it was either that
you're
or
like an unpaid staff photographer, basically.
Totally. And it was like that or going to my psychology class. And so I just shot a ton. And then of course that opened the door to then Dwayne and Jeff and everyone would listen to like, what story do you want to do?
Right.
And it led to pitching stories and getting assignments to go and do projects. But it was sort of, I don't know. I always say that like having time and having that commitment and willingness and the wherewithal to pull it off, like the financial wherewithal. Today, that financial wherewithal is a lot easier.
Right.
It's a digital camera and not, Shutter depressions that are film and processing.
Were you someone that held out on film, or did you get on board? Well, because I know a lot of people did, and even Jeff. Speaking of Jeff Aki, like the magazine did. I know the climbing magazine kind of like held the slide, like at much higher esteem for way longer than they probably should have. But
no, I mean, I've always been a guy. I'm not the guy that wants to be like right on the edge of the floor. I don't want to be on the front end of like using new technology, but for me, it's just about the pictures. It's about the stories. Like if you want me to, I'll shoot it on whatever
tech is going to work.
Yeah, it's like the tech is secondary to me. I want a super reliable camera that when I press that shutter, it's going to work
and do what you see through
That's it. No, I think digital photography has raised the bar. I mean, we're seeing in the climbing world, a great example. We're seeing infinitely better still photography because of digital cameras than film, because you get instant feedback. I mean, it's, slide film. It was, you'd go on an expedition, you'd come home with 100 rolls of film, ship it to the lab. 3 weeks later, you'd realize, oh man, I screwed that up. Something was wrong.
When you mentioned the scratch, that's so brutal.
Yeah,
I remember the scratches.
Terrible.
Or a black roll.
Yeah. Oh, those were the worst. Those were the worst.
Because I'd go on a trip, to Australia or whatever with 10 rolls.
Right.
And that's your whole trip.
Right.
And you're trying to create memories, and you get home and you accidentally pop the back open, or you didn't even know it. It's the worst.
Yeah.
It's like we're talking about things that nobody even knows about.
Yeah. The weirdest thing to me, Chris, is I feel like it's still like I have to remind myself that I'm not a kid anymore. I feel like we're just so lucky in this world of climbing, and I pinch myself. I feel like I found two things that I loved, which was being outside, specifically climbing and taking pictures. And what's crazy to me is those stories of shooting, Ricky at the Happy Boulders. It just feels like yesterday. It doesn't feel like 30 years past, 20 years past. And I don't know. I think that's a healthy thing. I mean, I lose track of time, but it's like when I talk about film is like this, it's just sort of a byproduct of the time, but the stories still feel like yesterday. Right. I have a really hard time differentiating something that happened 5 years ago and something that happened 20 years ago. If I really pinpoint it, I can kind of decipher that that was I wasn't married.
Yeah, you're not a
kid.
Idiot.
Yeah, I'm not an idiot.
Just
but
the feeling of it.
Yeah, I mean,
the sort of emotional quality of the time.
It's the power of what we do. Right. It's the power of being passionate about climbing and passionate about storytelling. It makes these experiences timeless. Yeah. And it's like, I just find myself doing that a lot, where I bump in, I just was walking around at the trade show and you bump into people and I'm looking at, a guy that I've spent tons of time with traveling around the world, and he looks old, and I realize, damn, I'm old too. How did this happen?
That motherfucker looks old.
Yeah, he looks old. Then I have
terrible.
Then I remember, oh, I do too. I look old and terrible. Yeah, how about that?
Poor guy. What happened to him? Glad we never met before. Pretty much.
I know.
You have nothing to judge me by. I've always looked like this, as far as you know. Poor guy. But I wanted, you're talking about a little bit. You said something about the death of print, and we were talking about movement to digital and social media. But, here you are. One of the reasons we ended up hooking up now was because of a book coming out. So let's just talk about that. We've been at it for a while here. So let's talk about this book, because so many of the things you've been talking about, in my mind, dovetail into what this book is about.
Sure.
Tell me the concept.
Well, I'm super excited. So in September,
a book
is coming out.
A stack of papers stuck together by glue.
That's right. Now, I will say in the foreword to this book, which is called Stories Behind the Images, it was really important to me that it was a soft cover book.
Okay.
And I want people to treat it like a magazine. I want them to put it in their backpack. I want them to put it in the pocket in the front of the airplane seat and read it, put it on the back of the toilet. There are 53 essays in the book, and they're individual photographs, and I tell stories about those photographs. And oftentimes they're stories about the people in those photographs. They're the kind of anecdotal tales from the field. Oftentimes they're self-deprecating, with hopefully a life lesson in there. But I'm very honest about my mistakes and fumbles along the way. And the friendships and the losses, frankly, along the way, with a little bit of technical stuff mixed in, a little bit of how to mixed in. And they're not in the book, and Stories Behind the Images. I didn't want it to be a portfolio of here's my 50 greatest hits. It's some of the pictures aren't that great. Some of them, they're all solid, but they're not the best photographs. But there's always, I hope, a good story behind the photographs, because at the end of the day, we started this podcast by talking about, storytelling, and that's my real passion. It's being outside and it's telling stories. I use the medium of still photography and video to tell those stories. But this is a pretty word heavy book. It's a 280 something page book with real essays that I hope some of them make you laugh, and I hope some of them make you cry. I never intended it for it to be a memoir, but it's a bit of a memoir. Like it's a bit of like, you can't help but if you tell stories about photos shot over the last 30 years, it turns into, some pretty good tales, and it kind of spans my adult life and my career.
What you mentioned, walking into to Tom Frost's house, looking at his portfolio and just being blown away by all these pictures and images. Sorry, pictures, photos, images. What do we? Yeah, images.
Yeah,
images.
The only one that's hard, like for photographers, the one is shots. That's
okay.
the one where Greg Epperson would. But it's images, photography, photographs. That's all. That's all.
Cool.
That's
so
all PC.
You've got. I mean, you have servers full of photos. You have somewhere in your house are file cabinets full of slides, right? So 53 photos. Like what the hell? How did that happen? How did you do that?
It turns out it's really hard to make great photos. I mean, that maybe I might have been the most successful in that first 6 months on the road. I took 100 rolls of film and I submitted 80 pictures, and a bunch of them got used. The
ratio never met
the
that
ratio
again.
did, it turns out that was like the high points of my whole career. It's been all downhill since then. Now it requires like 100 rolls of film to make one great photo. Mm-hmm. But no, I mean, you honestly, you look back at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of photography, and it's really hard to make those special moments. It's the Jim Collins wrote a book, Jim obviously being a climber.
Right.
And also an incredible human being. But Jim wrote a book, Good to Great. And I think good to great, that philosophy applies to a lot of things in life, including photography. I can go out and make good pictures all the time.
Right.
Consistently. I'm a pretty consistent, I can make good pictures. Making great pictures, that's hard.
Right.
That's hard. It's really hard to make great pictures. So, it's actually a little sad when you put it that way. It's like, wait, so there's 50 pictures at the end of your... You're halfway through your career and there's 50 pictures. That's it. That's all you got, man. No,
and like you said, a few of them aren't even that great.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really 42.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think the reality is definitely it could be a much larger book. There's a lot of other pictures that I love, but the process of coming up, not every picture has a great story behind it.
Right.
You can have a wonderful picture, a great picture that's not a storytelling photograph.
Sure.
Or that there's not a great story behind that photograph. And so it was pretty cerebral, the process of going through images. And really, I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about photographs and trying to decide, is there a solid enough story behind this image? Or is it not enough?
Or wrote it and it wasn't. Or
you start like riffing on it. You start kind of, doing, you just brainstorm on the image, and you spend a half an hour, and you realize, nah, that's not going to hold water. Right. Or it's too similar.
I was just working that day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or there's just nothing memorable.
Right.
Right. I mean, for me, the process is very much, I spend a lot of time, I find I'm like the most creative when I'm walking or riding my bike. And so in developing this book project, I would look at pictures, think about a picture, have 3 or 4, and then I would go out for like a 2-hour bike ride or a 2-hour hike. And I would just sort of be in my own world thinking, and I'd discipline myself to sort of, for 30 minutes, I'm going to think about this photo. 30 minutes, I'm going to think about the next photo. 30 minutes. And then I'd land on, okay, this one has the best story. And then oftentimes, maybe not on the same bike ride, the next day I'd go out for another mountain bike ride, or I'd be traveling, sitting in an airport, lounge or in a hotel lounge, or sitting in a tent, whatever the case may be. And then I would use just my iPhone to voice memo. I'd tell the story like I was sitting around a campfire. And this is kind of like going back to that very first trip with my, junior high school teacher. It's like that skill of telling a story. And I would pretend I'm sitting with folks around a campfire, and I would just tell my story for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes into an iPhone. And, I've thought this through in my head. I've given it thought, but instead of penning it, I would tell it to the iPhone. As though that was my audience. And then I worked with your good friend, Andrew Bisharat, who's an incredibly talented, I always say one of the most gifted, fast writers on the planet. I think he has, he just has a higher IQ than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And then I would send I'd send my campfire tale to Andrew, and Andrew would, sometimes verbatim, but sometimes with like his, he would do some wordsmithing on the first kind of transcription of the story. And then we'd go back and forth a few times, and that would become the essay. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of a fun process, actually.
Did you have another editor that could yay or nay a photo and a story?
No, it's kind of just Matt. I mean, I'm sorry. It was just Andrew and I.
Okay.
We, at one point, we had Matt Samet do a pass copy editing.
Right.
And then
but he wasn't going to say this photo's got to go.
No, probably not.
Okay.
I mean, I guess there were moments in the process of getting down to those 53 photos. We might have had like 70 at one point. And I think I did shop it around my office and kind of got everyone's 2 cents. And, sort of people loved certain images, didn't like other images. But it was more complicated.
You had to fire like 2 people.
Yeah, a couple people lost their jobs. Right. Yeah. No, but it's tough. It's not just about the photograph because and like I said, some of the photographs, they might not be the greatest photographs, but the story's really good. Oh, Honnold must be going to a dinner appointment now.
That guy gets around.
Oh, that was dinner. Now he's going to the Real Rock screening.
We'll see him later.
That's pretty funny. Can I tell you one Honnold story, whether it makes it or not?
Yeah, do it.
I was just thinking when he said his mom was here earlier today. I was shooting in Yosemite. This is 10 years ago, and I was actually like chasing a girl. Like I wasn't dating, and there was this super cute girl from Sacramento, and I followed her to the pizza deck, and her girlfriend was kind of hanging out with Honnold, but no one knew Honnold's name at the time. And I'm sitting at the pizza deck, and Alex and I all of a sudden are like forced to talk to each other, and Alex being like a genius. He sort of knew I said, hey, I'm Corey. And, I had like a camera sitting on the table, and he said, oh, you're, immediately. He's like, you're Corey Rich. I said, yeah, I'm a photographer. And I said, what do you guys do today? And Alex said, I forgot what her name was. I dragged her up Astro Man. It was like super boring. I mean, just like that. That's how I said, I dragged her up Astro Man. It was super boring.
Like right in front of her.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, she was like half talking to this, to her girlfriend. And I'm, and this like at the moment in time where I'm like, I know all of the greatest climbers. Like I mean, I don't know you. Like
right.
and I immediately in my head I think you're either like the next freaking superstar, or you're just completely full of shit. And I ask him. We have like a 10-minute conversation. I thought I masked like the look on my face. I thought I masked what I was thinking pretty well. Because in my head I was thinking, yeah, this guy's just full of shit. Like he went on to say a few other things where I thought, what? What are you talking about? Okay, all right. And then you free soloed the rostrum, and okay. And then years later, Honnold, we became good friends, and we'd worked together a number of times. And a couple of years ago, he and I were hanging out somewhere, and we were just, hanging out at a dinner table, and somehow that story came up, and I said, do you remember that, Alex? Like, you remember when we were hanging out in Yosemite and you told me that you'd like dragged your then girlfriend up Astro Man and it was boring? And Alex, being again like a genius, Alex looks at me and he says, yeah, and I remember you just looked at me and thought, this guy's full of shit. And now he's getting escorted by police convoys
all over Denver. Like in the last hour and a half, he's gone like 4 different places. It's crazy.
Oh man, it's just funny how that stuff happens. It was hard to edit the book because you couldn't just look at it face value. Here's 70 pictures, get it down to 50.
Right.
Because you kind of had to know the story behind the image and say, is the story more valuable than the photo? Sometimes the story is better than the photograph. Sometimes the photograph's as good as the story. And so it was hard to get it down to 53. Certainly the team at the Mountaineers were awesome. Like they actually helped me beef up the book a little bit. Like I think I was being even more critical. I wanted it to be tighter. And they're like, no, it's okay. Like let a few more images into the book.
Right. Yeah. As you've looked back on all these images and you've talked about, the stories that go behind them, another parallel, we opened with some kind of interesting parallels, or at least in my mind, between what I do or what I'm doing in my life and what you did. And one thing that I've noticed with what you do is that maybe it's out of respect or whatever, but a lot of the subjects of your, at least climbing photography, I think have become some of your close friends.
Oh yeah.
And it's interesting with this podcast thing that I'm friends with several people that I met the first time I talked with them on this podcast, because even in this moment we can share a lot of stories and get sort of a really good glimpse of each other. What does that feel like when you're shooting someone and on these is it because you're on expeditions? Is it because you're getting these intimate sort of moments from them of difficulty, of stress? I mean, how does that work?
I feel like the greatest gift of this career is spending time with amazing people who, as you just said, become your closest friends. I think climbing is so special in that, unlike NBA basketball, if you love basketball, the pros play on one court and it's in an arena and there's 10,000 people around that arena, around that court. Climbers, guess what? Like Tommy and Alex and Beth and Andra, and they're all going to the same crag that you and I are going to. And like, we might be on like an easier climb 25 feet to the left or 100 feet to the left, but we're on the same court. Like that's what's amazing about climbing. We go to the same practice fields. We go to the same court. Our crags are the crags. Like, it's where, if someone wants to go and climb cracks, they're going to the creek. And I think that's something that I didn't understand early on in my career. Like I didn't know any of the kind of the legends of climbing when I was 20 years old, but I spent a lot of time outside and I wanted to make pictures. And so I bumped into the Beth Roddens of the world and the Tommy Caldwells of the world and the Chris Sharmas of the world, because we all share that same playground. We're all in that same court. And then you just start spending, look, it all comes down to like people and wanting to spend time around people that you appreciate and admire and like enjoy their company. I mean, I say this all the time. Life is short. Like, I don't want to spend time around assholes. Right. Like I just have zero. I'm just not inspired. I'm not motivated. I can't be creative. And I feel like one of the greatest gifts in my career and in the climbing culture is that we get to bump into, we meet lots of people by being at the base of a crag. Belaying's like the ultimate gift, right? You're belaying and there's some guy next to you and you just start rapping and then you meet him at the campfire. And that's how I've met some of, sort of the greatest climbers of our time and how they've become my best friends is by spending time at the campfire and at the crag. And then eventually, you're sitting in vans together, driving across the country and getting on planes together and sharing tents together. And I think it was a generational thing. Like I grew up with this generation of climbers, and what excites me is that there's a photographer, there's a young storyteller. He or she is now like doing what like they're starting that experience right now. They're going to grow up with the next generation of climbers, but that gift of hanging out with sort of not just hanging out, like being the documentarian of one of the documentarians of this generation has been so rewarding because of the people.
Right.
It's, I unquestionably, some of my closest friends happen to be like the best climbers of our generation because we all shared that same playing field. And, to make it work in this industry as a climber, you need media, like you need photographs. And I think to make it work as a photographer, to be a storyteller, a content creator, you need access to people that are kind of pushing the envelope and raising the bar and setting the standard. And so there's kind of this perfect marriage, actually. Yeah, I never like set out to make that happen. It's just naturally how that occurs in our industry.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, we're sort of lucky that these guys and girls that are the best for the most part. Yeah, they're all pretty cool.
They're good people.
Yeah, they're good people. I don't think that's another thing that like the NBA or whatever, are not always the case.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I can't think of a single, I mean, I can only think I can count it on one hand, one or two experiences in my career where I thought at the end of a trip, I can't hang with this person.
Right.
Climbers just in general tend to be pretty damn solid people. We're rooted in the same value system. We care about the planet. We care about kind of our mental health. We care about our physical health. We camaraderie and relationship. And it's we all care about those same things. And it's, one of the great rewards is now watching everybody grow up together, sort of watching. A couple of years ago, we were in Spain, my wife and I and our daughter, and we went and visited Chris Sharma and his family. And it's just this magical moment when you realize like we were all kids together, like we were all kind of finding our way together. And now it's, we've moved on to that next phase in life. Like, Chris is still an incredible climber, but now he's like running a business and he has a kid and he's married but still that same philosophy, like the value system hasn't changed. And I think that's true for Chris. It's true for Tommy. It's true for Beth. It's true for, kind of the list of incredible athletes that I feel like I've been fortunate to both photograph, but also call some of my closest friends. It's awesome to now experience the rest of the journey with them. And I think, I don't know if you read Beth's op-ed piece.
No, I just saw it. I haven't read it yet.
I just read it on the plane out today. And it was, we're just living in a freaking great time. We're living in a time where, that our culture, our climbing culture embraces the idea that it's not just about doing the hardest stuff, the scariest stuff, but it's actually about creating a lifestyle. And, the essence of what Beth said is like, she's a great female climber, but also a mother, and like the industry still embraces who she is and supports that. And it's, I think I'm really proud that we're part of an industry where we value as a culture and as an industry that part of growing up and part of turning this into a lifelong passion is not just about difficulty ratings, but It's about how do you make this sustainable? How do you have a family? How do you make this part of your lifestyle for the long game? And I feel like we're fortunate enough that we can do that.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, but also thanks. I mean, you talked about the inspiration that you got from Tom, but the thing about what you've done, I think, over your career is inspired everybody. I mean, we sort of owe you a debt. And, you talked about your inspirations. You talked about Greg and Jim, Galen to a certain extent, Tom. It's like you're now that person. You're in that group for, like you said, the next generation. But also, I think so many images that the listeners don't even know were yours, but just like blew their minds or got them thinking or, inspired them to go do something were your photos. And so thanks, man. I want to thank you.
That makes me feel old. Thanks.
All right, folks, thanks for listening. And thanks to Corey for sitting down. He actually kind of made a special trip out of his way to Colorado for that one. And I appreciate that a great deal. And if any of you are wondering why we didn't talk about Everest or taking pictures of Honnold's naked butt, well, first of all, the pictures of Honnold's butt, oiled and graceful, hadn't happened yet. And also, you're thinking of Corey Richards. Now, it's ironic, a little bit strange coincidence that two of the modern great climbing photographers are so close in moniker. Corey Richards. Corey Rich has an E in Corey. Corey Richards does not. But yeah, kind of confusing. I know they both deal with it ad nauseum. Maybe we'll have Corey Richards on another time, and then we can have them both on at the same time. Confuse the hell out of everybody. Okay, that was a long one, so you're probably exhausted. So let's just get out of here. Don't forget to check your knots.
Now you're a lemma. Running as a pack. Yes, we go left. We go right. Yes. There's a predator out of the jungle. What's going on? Burrow! That's right, you're a lemma. It's all you've got. You don't have sharp teeth capable of biting. Make an interconnected series of tunnels like the Viet Cong. And look. I'm not even shooting you. It's crazy. And I'm spent.
Teachers told me that's where it's at.